I learned the modes in high school. Bill Westcott, my music teacher, had a theory class going. That's how I learned about all the diatonic modes. And it was impressed upon me that I might want to develop my own opinion about each one of the modes. So how do you do that? You write them out, you memorize the spaces between the notes, the intervals, you try to sing them, you try to memorize them so that when they're coming at you from some other source, some other player, that you can say, hey, that's Lydian dominant, that's major, that's Aeolian, I recognize that. And then the other part is, if you're a player, well then you might want to memorize where those things are in different keys. So I started with pedal point exercises. I'd get a pedal point, in this case E, and I'd just start to play different modes. After a while, after I memorized where they were, I started to concentrate more on how they blended, which ones sounded good going one to the other, which ones didn't sound good, which ones had common tones. For instance, like major and Lydian, very little difference. So is there a source there for some interesting music? Is it more dramatic if it goes from major to minor? And that's one of those questions that gets answered pretty quickly. So I would just start like this. So I'm starting with Lydian. You can think of it as a major scale with a raised fourth. Then go to Dorian maybe. And maybe Mixolydian, major scale with a flat 7. Maybe Aeolian dominant. So like a minor scale with a major third, you can think of it that way. Lots of different ways to do it. Might go regular minor. Back to major scale. Back to Lydian. Mixolydian. To Lydian. Maybe do a Dorian again. Do a little Phrygian dominant. It's like a Phrygian scale with a major third. And you know, with all of these, I'm not playing too crazy because I'm really trying to take in some melodic information. There is a kind of a harmonic bank that you kind of build up. You know, you're playing a couple of notes in a Phrygian dominant scale. There's a tension there, you know, because I'm ending on a minor 6, so there's waiting for some sort of resolution to happen. And so I'm almost thinking chordally in a little bit of a way, you know. And that's probably where a lot of the work goes in with modes, besides just learning them in 2 and 3 octaves in every key. Eventually you'd want to think, well, what's a Lydian progression? What's a Phrygian dominant progression? So you have to look at the scale. You've got to see what kind of triads get built off of each note in that scale, and then what kind of 2s and 4s and 6s and 7s are available to those chords as well. And eventually you can start to relate to the modes not only as just scales, but as keys, and then eventually they almost become emotional themes, really, because that's, you know, after you get past the musical part, it's more like the emotional impact that the audience receives. They're not thinking intervals, you know, they're feeling the music. There is a kind of psychology of music, let's say, that gets exercised here. Major scale is going to present a brighter, happier sound, right? So you would use that not to project sadness in general, let's say, right? And you would use a minor scale to do just the opposite of that. That's sort of like the conventional wisdom. Of course, we like to play with that a little bit and see if we can play against type there, I think. There are some scales that do that, like the Phrygian dominant. I mean, it's got the happy, but it's also got the sad and the disturbing and a little bit of tension. In a way, you might think that it sort of serves two different parts of the audience that wants to feel up and the one that wants to kind of brood a little bit. So it's got this, you know, brooding is a very interesting kind of a sound altogether. But a lot of that also has to do with what you lean on in a scale. So you take a major scale, and if you're just leaning on these two notes of the major scale, the 4 and the 7, well, it's not all that happy unless you somehow resolve it. And Phrygian dominant also has notes in it that are not very tense, so you could not particularly tense there, because I'm not using those notes that bring out that tension that are part of the Phrygian dominant scale. But you could take a simple riff like this, let's say. It's got a minor 7th and a regular 4 and a 5. But what happens if that was Lydianized? So I'd have to go. And that's one way that you can look at some of these scales and say, well, I've got a riff, and I'm using this particular scale, it's leading me down this particular road. What if I want some sort of a reverse image of this riff, harmonically or emotionally? And that might be the thing to do, where if you've got this sort of, let's say you started with Lydian, you've got a melody that's, you know, major with that little something added in there, that sharp 4th. But if you suddenly go, and the melody goes, you've kind of taken your same riff, the same emotional message, but you've sort of tweaked it a little bit just by saying, well, if I've got a riff that's using 1s and 7s and 4s and 5s, what kinds of 7s and 4s am I using here? And just by switching them to major or minor or augmented or straight up, you know, you get sort of a different flavor out of it, and that might suggest to you a different way to improvise. On a more simpler note, when I was doing Always With Me, Always With You, we have that simple progression, 1-4-5 progression. But after doing the melody, I switch it suddenly to minor, and it becomes. I don't resolve the 5 chord either. So this is a typical way of keeping the message of the song going in the same direction, but we're just taking a left turn on how we explain, let's say, the whole story behind it. We give a different viewpoint. Almost like what Bowie used to do with lyrics. He'd be writing, singing a song to you from one perspective, and then another bridge or another verse comes, and he sings it from some other person's perspective that's in the story, you know, and then gets back to it. It seems a little jarring at first, but then what it really does is add depth to the final product. Sometimes it can be simple. Once again, if you're improvising, let's say, more of a bluesy kind of a thing. I'm just using like a C blues scale. So right there, I'm going from using minor thirds to the major third, and I could probably, if I wanted to get adventurous, and there I'm just sort of very quickly running through using the major third, the flat 9, the flat 5 there, but landing on something that's a little bit more familiar, the major 6, and then maybe ending on a root like that. Now, I was taught in school that the brain remembers 11 notes, and that if you want to go outside, you can go outside, but by the time you get to the 11th tone, if you want people to feel like you're still in, you got to make sure that note's in. And if you go beyond that, then people basically receive it as that guy's out, he's playing out, you know what I mean? So that's something you can kind of play with. Again, if your structure is minor pentatonic, but you want to just try something if you brought up this rhythm section, that if you start to go while that's playing, it would just sound awful. Right. But if you're in B and it's more of a, and it's got a sort of things that remind you of pentatonic blues rock, that you can almost play anything. Right. And even if the progression is you could start with a you know what I mean? And it would still go with it. In other words, the scale doesn't necessarily have to match up with the chord progression. You know what I mean? But yeah, others, if you're going, I mean, that's totally different. It's a different style of music, and so it's less accepting of you opening those little doors that you talked about and adding the extra notes, the blue notes, the scary notes. But yeah, Blackmore was one of those guys that would, when you least expect it, you know, over sort of a pedal point groove, yeah, and between him and John Lord, they would be tossing back exotic scales and Phrygian dominant and blues and, you know, somewhere in between the root and the fifth, there'd be a couple of different kinds of thirds in there. Almost minor, minor, almost major, major, on the way to the fourth and the fifth and in between, you know. And then you could do the, you know, and that's the, and it just becomes expression more than scale, which is great. I think that at the right moment, it liberates the listener's experience. And I believe that when somebody's worked out a piece of music and they stay with the scale, that they're more in danger of turning the audience off because they think that it's technical, it's overly technical. And that when the structure between the riff and the harmony and the melody and the improv is a little bit more accepting, that for some reason they think it's less technical. Now, you and I know it's equally technical. There's actually no difference between, you know, being loose or being tight melodically or with an improvisation when it comes to picking or sliding or any of that. It's still technique. But the audience hears it in a completely different way. And I think that's the emotional impact that comes from strict adherence to harmony versus a more liberal adherence to harmony and how you can improvise over it. It is important to learn all the modes in every key all over your guitar. That's a big order, you know. But in order to be free with that information, technically, you have to get past that memorization stage. You have to get past the visualization stage. And then you have to get past the whole concept of why you'd want to recognize a modal position that you're in and then how you would react to it. Again, if we have someone says, I've got this riff, and they say, I just need a little melodic thing on top of that. And so at some point you'd have to say, well, what is that? You know, it's this little F-sharp power chord kind of thing, then it goes to this E minor 7. And you'd say, well, what key is that? You know, and so you have to be, can you go from can you say, what are those notes? Can you recognize what chords they represent? And then the next step is, what key do those chords belong to? Are they in the same key, or is it a shift of key when the chord shift? And then if you add up the notes, you'd say, well, there's just a little ambiguity there because there's no third being expressed. So that means that's mine to play with. So is it, or is it... right? And so that's the kind of thing that I would do. And I might sit there, and if I was writing that, and play that a million times and try to figure out, do I want the Phrygian dominant version, or do I want the Phrygian, more of a bluesier sound? So, because I could go... or... and the way, how do you answer that? You say, well, how do I feel about it? What's the story I'm trying to tell? Or what do I want the audience to imagine? You know? Is this about a guy floating down the Mississippi Delta, or the Nile? Right, yeah. Maybe both. That's the kind of thing, you know, like in a G3 jam, that's what you hear, is where we might arrive at a spot in a Hendrix song where the riff is sort of open, and someone does Dorian, the next guy goes Phrygian dominant, the next guy plays with his teeth, the other guy just makes a noise, and the other guy brings out a power drill, and you know, and it keeps going back, and you can see the depth of the musicality of each player by how they're sort of playing around with this this opportunity that presents itself. And as I used to tell my students, the fewer the notes in the chords, the more freedom you have melodically when it comes to melody and improvisation. And the more it's sewn up, the you know, you start to get limited in how you can get outside of that without running the risk of people thinking you're just playing out for the effect of it.